Welcome to Rebel Speak and Be Encouraged. And today I'm reading from the 6th book of the Old Testament, at the end of the book of Joshua. And it comes before Judges. Joshua judges Ruth. I think that's a Lyle Lovett's album from way back. But anyway, Joshua judges Ruth. Here we are, Joshua chapter 24. And in this, it's just before Joshua's end of life. And he's telling the people, look, if you can't serve Yahweh well, choose this day who you'll serve, because Yahweh wants you to serve him well. And part of what I find intriguing is that Joshua in many ways doesn't really know the degree of God's grace. He is a noble person, and he doesn't think the people will serve Yahweh well. And the story is such a longer story than Joshua understands. That God's not, I say it so often, but God's not a tightrope walk. God is faithful. When we are faithful to God, God holds on to that long, right? That long abiding love of God. But Joshua is speaking to the people, and part of what Joshua is doing is he for me, when I read this at the end, he doesn't have much confidence in the people, but the people say, no, we're going to serve confidently. And then what's interesting is that's followed by kind of a crazy book of Judges where the people are, they are so very inconsistent. They are so very all over the place. But when they cry out to God, God responds to them. And you see this beginning of a relationship, an establishing of a people. A relational establishing of a people. God has so much time for the relational establishing versus authoritative establishing, even though so much of the language of the Old Testament is this authoritative establishing. When you spend time and see God's faithfulness, God's slow to angerness, God's deep desire for relationship. I'm going to bring this in, I won't remember the verse, but in Mark, there's at one point where it says so beautifully in the text, Jesus didn't want a lot of renown. He didn't want a lot of people following him because he wanted time with the disciples. He wanted time with those that were identifying with him. He wasn't seeking out fame. The relationships that were far more important than the possibilities of numbers. I think that's a beautiful, it made me think of motherhood. I just think it's a beautiful moment in Scripture, so telling of the heart of Jesus, so telling of the heart of God. So here we are in chapter 24, and I'm going to read, let me see where I am here. Okay, verse 8, I believe it is. Let me see. So then I sent Moses and Aaron, and I brought terrible plagues on Egypt, and afterward I brought you out as a free people. Such a beautiful, afterwards I brought you out. They leave Egypt. I'm being attacked by a kitten who's a teenager. After they leave Egypt as a free people. I want you to think about that. I brought you out as a free people. After that, I brought you out as a free people. But when your ancestors arrived at the Red Sea, so they get to the Red Sea as a free people, but they're barely free, aren't they? They're barely free. In a minute, they could be a clobbered people. In a minute, they don't have they do not have what they need to be a free people. But in God sees God's faithfulness, and God sees you and me via God's lens of faithfulness. God sees them as a free people. But when they got to the Red Sea, the Egyptians chased after you. And what's interesting in this, Joshua's going between, he's speaking a good bit back in their history, but he sees it with the lens of immediacy. It's just kind of how history's told, that you and your ancestors, you're not far apart. So they chased after you with chariots and horses. What are chariots and horses? These are statements of power. Okay, chariots and horses are something they don't have. Chariots and horses are expensive. They're weapons of war that the really powerful and the really those that have all the power have, and those without power can't stand up to. Right? They chased you with chariots and horses. Things that you just, right? A horse can run over you. A chariot can demolish you. They're images of destruction and power. When you cried to Yahweh, I put darkness between you and the Egyptians. There was darkness, there was distance. For all their power and all their authority and all their might, I put darkness between you and the Egyptians. I brought the sea crashing down on the Egyptians, drowning them. With your very own eyes, you saw what I did. This thing of, it says put it on the door, stapled it on the forehead. There's this way of keeping your memory so relevant to God's faithfulness. Remembering God's faithfulness to the generations that have gone before you. Knowing who you are in the story of God's faithfulness. Very important. A way to see history with an immediacy. The lens of God's faithfulness, immediate. With your very own eyes you saw what I did. Then you lived in the wilderness for many years. Now I want to talk about the wilderness. That's a different enemy. The Egyptians, that's a powerful enemy. And in this storyline that I'm looking at, there's a facing of demonstrable powers, right? Powers that have demonstrable ability to destroy you. And the wilderness is one of those. The wilderness, people don't wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. There's not what they need for life there. The wilderness is a place of death, not a place of life. It's a place of futility. The wilderness is nowhere you long to be, right? In the wilderness, we have longings. We have longings for land that's not like the wilderness. But God meets them in the wilderness. God sustains. God brings the food, the manna. God brings the water from rocks, right? Where there's no water. One dies in the wilderness, specifically this wilderness, for lack of water. God is able to bring water to the wilderness. Their shoes don't run out. There's provision in the wilderness. They defied, if you will, the wilderness. They were able to defy the wilderness. This is part of Joshua's proclamation of God's faithfulness, that they lived in the wilderness. We can look at the wilderness as, I have that word demonstrable. It's God's grace and goodness was demonstrated in the wilderness. But it's easy for us to read this story as punishment, when there's something that God's building within them and edifying within them in the wilderness. So then you lived in the wilderness for many years. You survived that wilderness, that place where the wilderness wins, you won. Where the wilderness, right, the wilderness is a place of death, but you lived there for many years. I can even say there was a thriving in the wilderness. Finally, I brought you into the land of the Amorites on the east side. So if I'm looking here, this is how I kind of do my map. So from your side, it's not working, but from mine it is. Here's the Mediterranean, here's the Bible land. Over here's Babylon, and then kind of there's the Jordan River. And the land God's promised them is west of the Jordan. It's west of it. But they're asking as they cross over, they're coming out of the wilderness like this, the land of the Amorites here. They're asking permission to cross over, and it's denied to them. So God's not wanting them to take this land. The land that God has provided for them is here, west of the Jordan. But when they ask for permission to cross through, the different kings on that eastern side of the Jordan fight instead of grant. They're saying, can we just walk through? And they fight them, they resist them. And in the end, it's just going to say it here, they get more land because of that. Finally, I brought you into the land of the Amorites on the east side of the Jordan. That's not their promised land. They fought against you. See, these enemies that aren't meant to be there. Enemies we face that should just I'm just trying to get through here. I'm not even wanting a fight here. But a fight, God gets you through that, okay? They fought against you, but I gave you victory over them, and you took possession of their land. This kind of what I'm imagining here are different enemies that we are in the midst of facing. And sometimes there's things where we're trying to get to that longing, that land, okay? We're trying to get there. And we've got the Egyptians holding us back badly. We've got the wilderness where we could die and not survive. We've got to kind of get through that eastern side of the Jordan to get to where we're going. And that very place that should just let us pass through, it shouldn't be that big a deal, fights us, takes us on, wants to ruin us. And instead, our land is increased through that aggressive behavior, one that didn't need to be aggressive against us. Then Balak, son of Zippor, this is happening on that eastern side of the Jordan, king of Moab, started a war against Israel. He asked Balaam, and Balaam's over more towards Mesopotamia. The king of Moab sends for Balaam to come and curse the people because there's something about them that seems unstoppable. And this king wants them stopped. This king of Moab wants them stopped. So he goes and gets a known kind of, I don't know, this man whose ability is to curse and diminish. And he gets this Balak, son, I get these names mixed up. Balak is the king, and he gets Balaam to come and curse the people. Son of Zippor, king of Moab, started a war against Israel. He asked Balaam, son of Beor, all these B's, to curse you, but I would not listen to him. I just want to say, situations and places in your life that you can feel the proactive hatred for you. You can feel things coming together to work against you. God says, I won't listen to it. I'm not listening to it. I wouldn't listen to him. Instead, I made Balaam bless you. And so I rescued you from Balak, the king of Moab. And that's all they're going to cross the Jordan River, and then they're going to take the land. But some things I wanted to talk about is that there are places in our life right now that are trying to get us to capitulate to their authority. They're wanting Egypt. Egypt is defined authority. It has defined authority. It has defined power. It has carriages and horses. These are things so much greater that you and I are just, we could fall prostrate before them because they're so much larger. Their authority is so much greater than our authority. Their power is real. It's real power. And there's ways that Egypt wants you and I to capitulate to it right now. There's the wilderness. The wilderness, that's very different. The wilderness, the power of the wilderness is just lack of resources, and it's inhospitable. Situations that we're in that are genuinely inhospitable to us. And God has a grace to get you through this inhospitable environment. If you find yourself in an inhospitable environment right now, God has the grace to get you through it, to grow you in it, and to move you out of it, okay? There's a place, like I'm in this inhospitable environment, and there's things that my heart's longing and yearning for, right? That promised land, I'm longing and yearning for it. God has the grace to see you through the wilderness at this time. God's arm is not too short to save. And you can look and just say, everything about this moment in time is just crushing and killing me, right? There's not food, there's not water. The heat is nuts. I'm sick of these shoes. I don't want to still be wearing the same shoe day after day after day. God's got you. God's got you, and God's provision is magnificent in the wilderness. And then there's those moments, the east of the Jordan, where we're just trying to get through. I'm not even wanting to bother you. I'm not even trying to start a fight with you. And situations and circumstances pick the fight with you. They pick the fight with you. And in the midst of that, God is sustaining you. God is bringing different outcomes than the enemy would insist upon. The enemy is calling forward those Balaks, calling forward situations to curse you, things that can be your undoing. Voices that would want you to capitulate to them. Don't. God's bringing you forward and out and beyond and into all that God has promised. God's goodness has makes a way in the midst of difficult circumstances. There's so much that wants to disestablish you, disestablish me at this time. Get us to surrender prematurely. Just say, okay, I don't have this fight in me anymore. Okay, I'll just stop. I'll just be less. I'm tired. I'm weary. The longed for, it just keeps being difficult, right? We got out of Egypt as a free people. And then we were, okay, excited to be a free people, but what does that mean in the wilderness? And then, okay, now we're making our ascent, right? Now we're moving towards it. And then there's hostile enemies where we should just be walking through, and we're weary. We came out of the wilderness weary, and now we're weary. But God sees God's self as provider. God sees God's self as sustainer. God's not mocking. God's not joking. God's not misleading. God's arm's not too short to save. And one of the things that I feel that could happen in this season, and this is all that I'm going to say, is that when they were moving out and they were in the wilderness, they had a nostalgia for the familiar of Egypt. And I don't know, sometimes I can hear the ways teaching that mock such deeply human parts of us. That there was a stability in Egypt that there wasn't in the wilderness. They were completely, desperately dependent on God. They could not make it. There's reasons people weren't living in the wilderness. They didn't have the enemies in the wilderness because no one lived there. But there's an ease of nostalgia for that which was easier. Prior in my life was a season that was easier. But that easier season wasn't moving you towards those promises. That easier season, a lot of needs were met, but dreams weren't getting fulfilled. And you might be anywhere in this storyline, but I just want to say, don't go after nostalgia. Don't yearn for that where there was safety, a certain sort of safety. There was familiarity. There was a certain sort of stability. But you weren't moving towards your dreams. Right now, you're moving in meaningful ways. Even as there's unsuspecting enemies, places that you thought you would just walk through this wouldn't be hard just to get from A to B, and oh no, that king of Moab just called Balak, the king of Moab just called Balaam in to curse you, and you can feel it, and this Balaam has a proven track record, but God makes him bless them over and over and over again, 3 times. You're getting somewhere, and God's goodness, whatever you're meeting on the road, don't be fatigued. Or you can be fatigued. That sounds stupid. You might feel fatigue. But know that you're not alone. That God's triumphant right hand, that mercy, that power, that goodness, that faithfulness is seeing you through and beyond and into all that God has for you. Be blessed, be encouraged.